This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. Good morning, I'm Carrie Saldo. It's Friday, May 1st. I'm here in studio with our Rundowners this week, Matt Barron, the principal of MLB Research Associates, Springfield Republican newspaper reporter Jim Kinney, and Berkshire Eagle News editor Greg Sukinnick. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
If you at home have thoughts while you're listening or watching our YouTube live stream, feel free to email us, therundown@nepm.org. All right. Coming up later in the show, our panel weighs in on the results of the Massachusetts Republican Convention and the future of the state's age of consent laws. First, some broader context for the week's news. The partial government shutdown has ended at 76 days, the longest in U.S. history. A California man has been charged with attempting to assassinate President Donald Trump following shots fired at the White House Correspondents' Dinner Saturday night. Looking more closely to home, some reporting from you, Jim Kinney, this week. Baystate Health is set to acquire Mercy Medical. This news from Tuesday, Baystate Health will take over Mercy Medical Center in a deal made necessary by a challenging financial environment for healthcare and a patient population dependent on Medicare and Medicaid. The transition, you said, will be quick, taking effect November 1st, Mercy and Baystate said on Tuesday. Jim, you reported these rumblings more than a year ago, and reportedly the talks have been going on between these entities for years. But now that it's official, what does this mean for patient care in the region?
Yet to be determined in many ways. Both sides are saying the predictable, reassuring things. We're still committed to quality care. But I talked with a competing hospital executive today. This week at Holyoke Medical Center, who said, yeah, you're going to cut things because otherwise why bother? You're doing this because of a financial pressure, so you're going to have to cut something somewhere.
Whether that's patient services or jobs, we don't yet know.
Yeah, they're very cagey. They're very cagey talking about jobs. I've talked to the unions, the nurses union in particular, which has been very on this for about a year. They have a successor clause, but they're getting their membership is nervous. I know that the personnel departments at other area healthcare providers have gotten phone calls from people asking about openings because anytime there's a shakeup, a change in a market, people start thinking about their futures in very real ways.
But more broadly, this was welcome news as far as the governor of the state was concerned, the state representatives were concerned, Springfield Mayor Dominic Sarno. There was a lot of concern that they would close abruptly like we saw, a year or so ago with Stewart Healthcare in the eastern part of the state.
Yeah, that loomed very large in all of these conversations, especially with the state. And there was a very real threat of that, from what I'm told, a very good fear. We talk about these talks being ongoing over a long, long period of time. At some point, they got stuck. And that's when, as the lieutenant governor explained to me, that's when Sarno and others brought in the state to find out ways to unstick and keep this merger process going.
Greg Sukinnick, as you're looking at this, what comes to mind?
What comes to mind is I think no one wins when a hospital closes. I mean, it's only been 12 years or so since Northam's Regional Hospital closed. It reopened 2 years ago with under its new owners from Berkshire Medical Center. I guess, that's a sort of a proof of the pudding thing, I guess, when you have one entity owning more hospitals. I mean, that's sure that there's efficiencies, but it begs the question what actually becomes of the Mercy campus. When efficiencies start being found and when these Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements start to disappear next year. Where does that leave a hospital structure and a patient population that was largely reimbursement driven?
And we've talked about it here on the show in the past. Baystate's Peter Banco was very vocal the end of last year, early this year, about the impact that might have on the hospital system. You reported, Jim, I think it's 80% Medicare and Medicaid patients at Mercy and 73 at Baystate. So it's a significant number. Matt Barron, though, as you're watching this now unfolding, what are you thinking?
So the big picture is that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has designated most of Western Mass as a medically underserved area. And as a HPSA, a health professional shortage area, means we don't have enough primary care doctors, dentists, and mental health professionals.
If you have your appointment, do not cancel it.
Yeah, and so, they'll get some back office efficiencies like in human services, human resources, purchasing. But as my colleagues here are saying, they're not doing this for the fun of it. There's probably going to be some job cuts, and how is that going to impact patients?
Yeah. Well, there'll be more news to come on that. Jim, one thing I was thinking about, we talked about this a few months ago on the show, was when Mercy Medical suspended its maternity care for women. Do we now know, with this acquisition, with Baystate coming in, whether or not that might be restarted?
They're very cagey on details. I would really doubt it, because maternity care is not a moneymaker. The forces that caused them to suspend are still in place. You have to remember that the campuses for Mercy and Baystate are only a few blocks away from each other.
Yeah.
You can look out the windows of one and see the other. I know that Senator Gomez has been assured that the Mercy campus will be reused, will be continued to be used, but there are real maintenance issues in buildings, condition issues on that campus as well.
And you pointed out in your reporting, which really hit home for me, that Mercy is really the care center of choice for folks living in one of Springfield's least resourced communities. So it will make a big difference as for whether or not people have easy access, whether they have a car, that closeness, that proximity is important to people.
Yeah, it came up very much in talking with the state lawmakers who'd been briefed, but also are in these neighborhoods in this Latino community. For generations, they looked to Mercy. It was Catholic, was run by the nuns. They were familiar with it. And now that is being broken.
Well, more to come on this as the days, weeks, and months. Greg,
just one little point. I guess that puts a lot of pressure on Baystate to, moving forward, because now, they're the provider. And so, that property becomes theirs. The doctor, the patients become theirs. I guess, my question would be, are they ready for this?
They say they are. It's going to be a quick transition. There's going to be challenges. Retaining talent is going to be an enormous thing. Remember, Mercy's owner, Trinity Health of New England, still retains ownership of some hospitals in Connecticut. If you really want to stick with Trinity, you could just go there.
The question may be, are the state regulators that have to approve this ready for this?
Yeah.
Because it reminds me of after there's a chemical spill, the flags come out and say the air is safe to breathe, the water is safe to drink. It's like pull the doll string.
Yeah.
Well, lots of things to keep watching as we move forward. Let's talk about the GOP convention. It was held on Saturday in Worcester. Tim Dunn of the Boston Herald said, quote, Mike Minogue has won the Republican endorsement for Massachusetts governor in a landslide victory, taking a whopping 70% of the votes there at the convention. Brian Shortsleeves, he eked onto the ballot, and Mike Keneally just missed it. Minogue's endorsement came as a record number of delegates gathered at the DCU Center in Worcester on Saturday for the Massachusetts Republican Convention to select nominees for governor, lieutenant governor, and other offices. In his speech to delegates prior to the vote, Minogue promised to repeal the net zero by 2050 climate mandate and the MBTA Communities Act, which we see having more of an impact out there in eastern Massachusetts, and to end free right to shelter laws for illegal immigrants in Massachusetts, and that he would protect the Second Amendment, among other things, if elected, as reported by the Herald. Matt Barron, you've had occasional Republican political clients here in Western Massachusetts. Minogue is a first-time candidate. He's a wealthy former biotech executive, a combat veteran, and a GOP donor who has supported President Trump. What's your take on Minogue's coming out victorious here?
Well, I was surprised that Keneally didn't get the 15% at first.
He worked under Charlie, as did Brian Shortley, but with Charlie Baker, and certainly known to the political establishment here in Massachusetts.
And the handful of polls over the winter showed him as the front runner for what that was worth. But the they talk about a record number of delegates, but it was actually less than 2,000 delegates. And I did some checking, and this is fascinating. In my Senate district, the Berkshire, Franklin, Hampshire, Hamden, 57 communities, only 6 communities have Republican town committees that held caucuses to send delegates. Next door in Senator Comerford's district, 25 communities, only 8 Republican town committees. So you look at Keneally, and he just missed the 15%. He could have last year gone into red communities like Southwick, Tolland, Granville,
Palmer,
Chester,
where I live.
Blandford,
Yeah.
and that voted for Donald Trump, and put a committee on the board. It takes 3 people, a chair, a secretary, and a treasurer, and he would have locked in support that he could have counted on at the convention, but he chose not to do it.
And Chris Van Buskirk, of WBUR, pointed out there were issues at the convention. There was delays in the voting, and some number of folks left. And whether or not that impacted Mike, we don't know.
Yeah, a lot of people in the comments said, if the party can't run a convention, how can they run the state? But this is an important thing. The local Republican or Democratic town committees are like the building blocks of a party, like the DNA. They gather the signatures to put their candidates on the ballot. They pound the lawn signs into the ground in the summer. If they don't have this local infrastructure, then it's a big problem. I don't think Minogue fits the traditional recipe for Baystate Republicans to draw enough independents. Moderate, pro-environment, fiscally conservative or fiscally sound, but I think he's a little too far right. Conventions, though, they draw the extremists. They draw, the activists. So, in that regard, it was the hard right Trumpers that showed up in Worcester for the Republicans. And
we saw
him.
Governor Healy, for her part, seize on that this week, saying the convention nominated the 2 Trumpiest Trumpers. And obviously, it's an election year. We're not surprised by that language, my paraphrasing of that language coming from the governor. But you touched on independents. Independents or unenrolled candidates in Massachusetts, they're the bulk of the elected voters here. 3.3 million in Massachusetts.
They control statewide elections.
1.3 million registered Democrats and about 423,000 Republicans. Greg, you're seated there in the blue of blue Berkshires.
Indeed.
How's this coming?
Well, we're reliably blue. They're in the Berkshires. There's that. So, what ground could be gained by a Republican candidate? That's an uphill fight. And I was noting the Boston Herald editorial talking about how Minogue is allegedly. They said that Minogue was Healy's worst nightmare. But that the connection between Minogue and Trump doesn't go away because the Herald editorial says it does.
But I think their point in the editorial was he's her worst nightmare because he's proven himself in the biotech industry as a leader, and now he can come into government as this newcomer and wide-eyed and see things that maybe political people who have been more career politicians haven't.
He's got to prove that, but you can bet that if I was Governor Healy, the first thing I'd do is stand next to that sign at the Williamsburg Cumbies this morning that says gas is $4.41 a gallon and ask who made that happen.
And she's going to point out that he had problems with his Biomed company. 49 people died. FDA launched an investigation. He paid a lot of fines. Now, maybe that won't matter in the age of Trump because what used to disqualify candidates pre-Trump is sort of a different situation now, but I think she'll definitely bring it up.
Well, one thing I want to touch on quickly, the Boston Globe had an editorial, and they wrote that the 15% rule used to cull candidates at state political conventions. They called it an anti-democratic relic. You're shaking your head no.
No, I will defend it to the end. I
Why?
was a delegate from 1982 to 2014 at Democratic conventions. Why? Because it forces candidates to campaign all across the state. I live in a rural town of 1,186 people. And if the 15% rule wasn't in effect, the candidates would only go to the largest population centers. They would never come to rural communities in Western Mass and address our issues.
I would also point out the number of Democratic nomination winners who didn't become governor or didn't even win their own primary. Francis Bellotti comes to mind.
Right.
I don't know why that name just suddenly popped in my head.
And there are a few others too. But next up, the Democrats hold their party in their convention in Worcester the end of this month. All right, still head on the rundown. What's the latest on the PCB contamination delaying planned wastewater treatment plant in Springfield? And what does the recent prosecution of a Berkshire's teacher on rape charges mean for the future of the state's age of consent laws? If you have thoughts, email the rundown at nepm.org. You're listening to the Rundown on 88.5 NEPM and streaming live on YouTube. I'm Carrie Saldo. We'll be right back.
The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield, with support services designed to help seniors age in place, including a Compass Memory Support Neighborhood. More at armbrookvillage.com.
Welcome back to the Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I'm joined by political consultant Matt Barron and journalist Jim Kinney and Greg Sukinnick. Let's get right back into it. Kinney, some reporting you did this week. Headline: Springfield Water Project faces year-long delay after toxic PCBs found. The cost could climb to an additional $31.5 million. This is a massive project on behalf of the Springfield Water and Sewer Commission, which you've been reporting on for some time. And you pointed out in this reporting that the Water and Sewer Department provides water to 250,000 customers in Springfield and in surrounding communities. Even this is, though it's a Springfield project, this is happening in Westfield. A little bit confusing there. Just want to put that on the table to keep things clear. And it's estimated to be $363 million at the outset. Remind us why this project is necessary.
It's necessary ultimately because of climate change. What's happening is, instead of getting steady rain, we're getting deluges. These deluges wash too much siltation and organic material into the reservoirs, which means that they got to hit that water with more chlorine, and that chlorine has a chemical reaction that makes a resulting chemical, and there's too much of that in the water. So they've got to move away from sand filters that are what the Romans used to
highly effective, obviously, if they've stuck around that long.
Yeah, to newer technology. And one of the things that blows people's minds, I talk about filters and people think it's the thing in your fridge.
It's about this, the size of a small rectangle or something.
I've interviewed Representative Neal standing in these things.
13 feet deep or something like that. You said in your reporting they're massive, massive. The idea was to save time and money, though, by building this new West Parish water treatment plant in the path that the water already takes, as you reported, from Borden Brook and Cobble Mountain reservoirs to its customers. Give us the latest info, Kinney. You had to file a public records request to kind of get some details on what's going on here. There have been PCBs found at the site, and it's delaying things.
Yeah, when they dug up some of these older filters that had been built in the 1960s, and they were put together with some caulk that was made with PCBs, and those PCBs had seeped into the surrounding concrete, the surrounding soil. PCBs were never found in the drinking water. That's something that's routinely tested
and that's really important to point out, because these are known or suspected carcinogens. They have real negative implications for people's health. And
that stopped work in July. They had also, complicating matters, some of the soil that had been removed had already been shipped to some construction companies, and some of it had been sold as fill. So that's somewhere.
Hopefully that's being tested. Now, Springfield is in the position of violating demands from state regulators. You write that it cited a cost listed in the headline, that $31.5 million, but your story points out there's a range of between $8.5 million and the $31.5 million for what this might cost. What's causing that chasm? That's a huge difference.
Yeah. The people who run water and sewer will tell you that it's because they're still in the process of testing all the soil to find out how high the concentrations of PCBs are. Lower concentrations they can deal with much quicker and more economically. Higher concentrations, have to be treated very a salt mine somewhere. God only knows what they're going to have to do with
It's a
this
very
stuff.
complicated process that Greg Sukenik of the Berkshire Eagle knows quite a bit about, because the Housatonic River in Pittsfield has dealt with PCBs as a byproduct of being used in General Electric facilities in Pittsfield. And then the Housatonic River wends its way through the Berkshires. The latest in this saga, we're in Lee, right?
Yes. So we're actually finally ramping up towards construction for the Rest of River project, which is the cleanup of the Housatonic from the confluence in Pittsfield. That's where the east and west branches meet, down to Rising Pond and Great Barrington. The other action moving forward on that is so construction of the landfill that Lee residents largely don't want for lower level PCBs is supposed to start ramping up this spring. There's a application. There's a proposal for rail sidings that are going to move PCB contaminated sediments, up and down the river along the Housatonic Railroad tracks to that landfill. And there's also the plan for Reach 5A, which goes from the confluence to about the city, the Pittsfield-Lenox line. I couldn't help but notice that you did talk about PCB contaminated fill. That's something we remember very well in Pittsfield from the 1990s when that was discovered in backyards. So there's some interest in that. Things are finally starting to ramp up after years and years of court fights and regulatory back and forth. But there is still opposition, and so.
There are people who don't want to see the dump essentially opened. And also people still, I remember covering this 20 years ago where people were vying for the destroying of PCBs as opposed to the toxic containment of it. And that remains a real push-pull in this.
There was an activist, there were some activists who met last weekend, and they got Chris Hedges to come and speak to them. And they're all sort of, trying to make
journalist
the push for
and author.
Yeah, journalist and author Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize winner. Whether it's been repeated over and over again that look, the remedy is the remedy, and that we looked at remediation, we decided we're gonna dispose, and so whether it's too late to make that change or not, I guess we'll find out.
Well,
people in the upper Hudson River lived through this for decades, and they were out on that river dredging for years.
GE Schenectady.
Yeah. Yep. Matt Barron, anything you want to say before we move on to the next topic? All right. So the headline here, former Miss Hall's teacher pleads not guilty to rape charges as accusers face him in court. This is reporting by Berkshire Eagle's Amanda Burke. Berkshire Superior Court was full on Wednesday, April 22nd, as onlookers awaited the arrival of a man at the center of a sexual abuse scandal that has engulfed Miss Hall's school and changed the lives of two alumni. Those alumni, Melissa Ferris and Hillary Simon, 2 years ago went public and accused a former Miss Hall school teacher, Matthew Rutledge, of grooming and rape. Rutledge pleaded not guilty to those 3 felony counts of rape. And to clearly define what grooming behavior is here, it can be giving gifts to students, giving them food, money, jewelry, just special attention, ways to ingratiate yourself to these, in this case, young women, and eventually take advantage of them. Greg Sukenik, Miss Halls is a private, all-girls boarding and day school in Pittsfield. This story broke in 2024. Heather Bello was all over this for the Eagle. But what's the reaction you've been hearing in the Berkshires?
The reaction, I think it's, to put it, really succinctly, what we saw online in a couple letters was it's about time, and and also the proposal. There's a proposal championed by State Rep Lee Davis that's still in the Ways and Means Committee that would raise I believe it would raise the age of consent to 18, because right now it's 16, and that's sort of the loophole here. And that loophole was the reason at first why rape charges were not brought.
The Berkshire DA came out and said the age of consent at 16 barred him from pursuing charges. And then subsequently, the school did a very detailed investigation, or hired a third party to do a very detailed investigation, which eventually prompted the DA to take a second look.
So, exactly what the change is that hasn't been specifically laid out. That's something we're gonna have to wait for in the trial and discovery. One interesting thing about this is we'd never seen Matthew Rutledge. In the 2 years that we've been sort of reporting on this story, and I'm glad you mentioned Heather Bello, who wrote this. That we'd been using old photos of him, and so his appearance in, I think one of the sort of key moments in this was his appearance in court was the first time we had actually seen him, in the 2 years since this had come out. So
and he hadn't really spoken publicly.
No,
now,
and it had very little to say.
The proposed legislation that you mentioned would make it a crime for adults in positions of authority or trust to sexually assault children, regardless of the state's current age of consent law. And advocates say that this is a huge loophole. Massachusetts is one of only just 10 states that haven't corrected this. Matt Barron, one advocate, and who's also a state senator in the eastern part of the state, she's been at this for 10 years trying. Lee Davis has a different version. Now they're working together. Why don't you think there's political will to close this loophole?
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. Lee Davis is a freshman state representative. The Senate sponsor, Joan Lovely of Salem, is a sexual abuse survivor herself. Yeah. And it speaks to the fact that the legislature is really run by two dictators, the Speaker and the Senate President. They control the flow of legislation out of committees to the floor. And the rank and file have sadly, very little input in that.
Jim Kinney.
Who's the opposition to this, though? Is it the insurance industry who's lobbying against this? There's not some creepy old guy lobby day, right?
Right.
One would hope not.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's an organized opposition. I just think it's the fact that the number of full formal sessions has gone down, the number of roll calls has gone down, the number of committee chairs and pay has gone up over the last 10 years.
Oh, sorry. Joan, go ahead.
No, go ahead. And the number of voter ballot referendums questions has gone up because
people are frustrated with the inaction. Yeah.
But Joan Lovely said for her part, she suspects that this has been a hard sell because it's very uncomfortable to talk about, right? And people don't want to face the fact that this is a reality in our world. That being said, clearly something that needs to be addressed. The Boston Globe had an editorial last week, quoting in part here, "For lawmakers to fail to act this year on changing the law and bringing Massachusetts up to what has become the national standard on consent would be shameful." Jim Kinney, will the fear of being shamed in the Boston Globe move the needle here? What's it going to take?
I think maybe a public referendum. I don't know if that's been talked about, but it is the kind of thing that would do well in front of voters.
Yeah.
It's kind of a slam dunk no-brainer.
Look at how many years we're now into the Me Too movement. Look at the impact that the Epstein files continue to have on the populace. And Massachusetts is considered a progressive state, so.
It'll be very interesting to watch this issue. Next steps here, Matthew Rutledge is due back in court on June 18th. You did some reporting this week, and it'll move us into our scoops, praise, and prediction part of the show, where I ask people to give a scoop on a story that they may be working on, heap some praise on a newsworthy nugget, or make a prediction about the week's news. I predict you might talk about Jarvis Rockwell.
Yes, I had the opportunity to write the obituary for Jarvis Rockwell, the son of Norman Rockwell, who died at the age of 94 this past week. He was an artist in his own right. He sort of used pop culture. He didn't call them toys, but sort of figures, and he made these sort of massive. He did a lot of collage art and sort of this kind of massive sort of sculpture, if you will, and that showed
these tiered pyramids, and just
it took up an entire gallery at Massimoka.
Hundreds and hundreds of these little toy figurines, and he thought he considered them pieces of art. His daughter called them toys.
Yes, and he was just kind of a great guy, and apparently had a tremendous belly laugh. So he'll be missed.
And I had forgotten that his brother Thomas Rockwell wrote the book How to Eat Fried Worms, one of my favorites as a kid.
Work that into the obit. That was the last line of the obit.
I loved it. Jim Kinney, scoop, praise, prediction?
Prediction, it's going to be very interesting with Hampshire College. They came out this week and said that real estate's for sale. That's going to be a huge question. If you ever wanted to own your own yurt/radio station, there's your opportunity.
Matt Barron.
So, 20-year incumbent state rep Angelo Popolo of Springfield had a very bad week in the media this week. He had some bad press on donations he's taken in stock sales from polluters, and a very scathing letter to the editor in the Reminder publications. Full disclosure, I'm working for his challenger, but my prediction is that Rep. Popolo will be defeated in the September 1st primary in a big upset.
Well, we will continue to watch that issue. You have been listening here to The Rundown on 88.5 NEPM. My thanks to Matt Barron, Jim Kinney, and Greg Sukinnick. My thanks also to our board op this morning, Kara Foster, and Chris, who's doing our video this morning for the YouTube live stream. I'm Carrie Saldo. You are listening to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. Join us every Friday. Have a great day.